Hello. I'm Mark Brearley, and welcome to Bedtime Stories, brought to you this evening from my factory here on the Old Kent Road. I'll share with you most of Bruno Schulz's The Street of Crocodiles, this one. It was published in 1934. I haven't read it and the author's other short fictions for more than 30 years, but the rich imaginings entwined with an acutely observed version of the writer's home city of Douhubiez is indelible, and for me those writings are forever there as a reminder of the humanity and depth of cities. When enjoying this one, the sense that all such richness is fragile magnifies with knowledge that in 1942 Schulz was murdered by a Gestapo officer in the street of that same city. The area of the Street of Crocodiles was an industrial and commercial district, its soberly utilitarian character glaringly underlined. The spirit of the times, the mechanism of economics, had not spared our city and had taken root in a sector of its periphery, which then developed into a parasitical quarter. While in the old city, a nightly semi-clandestine trade prevailed, marked by ceremonious solemnity, in the new district modern, sober forms of commercial endeavor had flourished at once. The pseudo-Americanism grafted on the old, crumbling core of the city shot up here in a rich but empty and colorless vegetation of pretentious vulgarity. One could see there cheap jerry-built houses with grotesque facades covered with a monstrous stucco of cracked plaster. The old, shaky suburban houses had large, hastily constructed portals grafted onto them, which only on close inspection revealed themselves as miserable imitations of Metropolitan splendor. Dull, dirty, and faulty glass panes in which dark pictures of the street were wavily reflected, the badly planed wood of the doors, the grey atmosphere of those sterile interiors where the high shelves were cracked and the crumbling walls were covered with cobwebs and thick dust, gave these shops the stigma of some wild Klondike. In row upon row there spread tailors' shops, general outfitters, china stores, drug stores, and barbers' saloons. Their large grey display windows bore slanting semicircular inscriptions in thick gilt letters: Confiserie, Manucure, King of England. The old established inhabitants of the city kept away from that area where the scum, the lowest orders, had settled. Creatures without character, without background, moral dregs, that inferior species of human being which is born in such ephemeral communities. But on days of defeat, in hours of moral weakness, it would happen that one or another of the city dwellers would venture half by chance into that dubious district. The best among them were not entirely free from the temptation of voluntary degradation, of breaking down the barriers of hierarchy, of immersion in that shallow mud of companionship, of easy intimacy, of dirty intermingling. The district was an El Dorado for such moral deserters. Everything seemed suspect and equivocal. Everything promised with secret winks, cynical stressed gestures, raised eyebrows, the fulfillment of impure hopes. Everything helped to release the lowest instincts from their shackles. Only a few people noticed the peculiar characteristics of that district, the fatal lack of color, as if that shoddy, quickly growing area could not afford the luxury of it. Everything was grey there, as in black and white photographs or in cheap illustrated catalogues. The similarity was real rather than metaphorical, because at times, when wandering in those parts, one in fact gained the impression that one was turning the pages of a prospectus, looking at columns of boring commercial advertisements, along which suspect announcements nestled like parasites, together with dubious notices and illustrations with a double meaning. and one's wandering proved as sterile and pointless as the excitement produced by a close study of pornographic albums. If one entered, for example, a tailor's shop to order a suit of cheap elegance characteristic of the district, one found that the premises were large and empty, the rooms high and colourless. Enormous shelves rose in tiers into the undefined height of the room and drew one's eyes towards the ceiling, which might be the sky, the shoddy, faded sky of that quarter. On the other hand, the storerooms, which could be seen through the open doors, were stacked high with boxes and crates, an enormous filing cabinet rising to the attic to disintegrate into the geometry of emptiness, into the timbers of a void. The large grey windows, ruled like the pages of a ledger, did not admit daylight, yet the shop was filled with a watery, anonymous grey light, which did not throw shadows and did not stress anything. Soon a slender young man appeared, astonishingly servile, agile, and compliant to satisfy one's requirements and to drown one in the smooth flows of his cheap sales talk. But when, talking all the time, he unrolled an enormous piece of cloth, fitting, folding, and draping the stream of material, forming it into imaginary jackets and trousers, that whole manipulation seemed suddenly unreal. A sham comedy, a screen ironically placed to hide the true meaning of things. The tall, dark salesgirls, each with a flaw in her beauty appropriately for that district of remaindered goods, came and went, stood in the doorways, watching to see whether the business entrusted to the experienced care of the salesman had reached a suitable point. The salesman simpered and pranced around like a transvestite. One wanted to lift up his receding chin or pinch his pale powdered cheek, as with a stealthy, meaningful look, he discreetly pointed to the trademark on the material, a trademark of transparent symbolism. Slowly, the selection of the suit gave place to the second stage of the plan. The effeminate and corrupted youth, receptive to the client's most intimate stirrings, now put before him a selection of the most peculiar trademarks, a whole library of labels, a cabinet displaying the collection of a sophisticated connoisseur. It then appeared that the outfitter's shop was only a facade, behind which there was an antique shop with a collection of highly questionable books and private editions. The servile salesman opened further storerooms, filled to the ceiling with books, drawings, and photographs. These engravings and etchings were beyond our boldest expectations. Not even in our dreams had we anticipated such depths of corruption, such varieties of licentiousness. The salesgirls now walked up and down between the rows of books, their faces like grey parchment, marked with the dark, greasy pigment spots of brunettes, their shiny dark eyes shooting out sudden zigzag cockroachy looks. But even their dark blushes, the piquant beauty spots, the traces of down on their upper lips betrayed their thick black blood. Their over-intense colouring, like that of an aromatic coffee, seemed to stain the books which they took into their olive hands. Their touch seemed to run on the pages and leave in the air a dark trail of freckles of smudge of tobacco, as does a truffle, with its exciting animal smell. In the meantime, the lasciviousness had become general. The salesman, exhausted by his eager importuning, slowly withdrew into feminine passivity. He now lay on one of the many sofas, which stood between the bookshelves, wearing a pair of deeply cut silk pajamas. Some of the girls demonstrated to one another the poses and postures of the drawings on the book jackets, while others settled down to sleep on makeshift beds. The pressure on the client had eased. He was now released from the circle of eager interest and left more or less alone. The salesgirls, busy talking, ceased to pay any attention to him. Turning their backs on him, they adopted arrogant poses, shifting their weight from foot to foot, making play with their frivolous footwear. abandoning their slim bodies to the serpentine movements of their limbs, and thus laid siege to the excited onlooker, whom they pretended to ignore behind a show of assumed indifference. This retreat was calculated to involve the guest more deeply, while appearing to leave him a free hand for his own initiative. But let us take advantage of that moment of inattention to escape from unexpected consequences of an innocent call at the tailor's and slip back into the street. No one stops us. Through the corridors of books, from between the long shelves filled with magazines and prints, we make our way out of the shop and find ourselves in that part of the street of Crocodiles where, from the higher level, one can see almost the entire length down to the distant, as yet unfinished buildings of the railway station. It is, as usual in that district, a grey day, and the whole scene seems at times like a photograph in an illustrated magazine. So grey, so one-dimensional are the houses, the people and the vehicles. Reality is as thin as paper and betrays with all its cracks its imitative character. At times one has the impression that it is only the small section immediately before us that falls into the expected pointillistic picture of a city thoroughfare, while on either side the improvised masquerade is already disintegrating and, unable to endure, crumbles behind us into plaster and sawdust, into the storeroom of an enormous empty theatre. The tenseness of an artificial pose, the assumed earnestness of a mask, an ironical pathos tremble on this facade. But far be it from us to wish to expose this sham. Despite our better judgment, we're attracted by the tawdry charm of the district. Besides, that pretense of a city has some of the features of self-parody. Rows of small one-story suburban houses alternate with many-storied buildings which, looking as if made of cardboard, are a mixture of blind office windows, of grey glass display windows, of fascia, of advertisements and numbers. Among the houses, the crowds stream by. The street is as broad as a city boulevard, but the roadway is made like village squares of beaten clay, full of puddles and overgrown with grass. The street traffic of that area is a byword in the city. All its inhabitants speak about it with pride and a knowing look. That grey, impersonal crowd is rather self-conscious of its role, eager to live up to its metropolitan aspirations. All the same, despite the bustle and sense of purpose, one has the impression of a monotonous, aimless wandering, of a sleepy procession of puppets. An atmosphere of strange insignificance pervades the scene. The crowd flows lazily by, and strange to say, one can see it only indistinctly. The figures pass in gentle disarray, never reaching complete sharpness of outline. Only at times do we catch the turmoil, among the turmoil of many heads, a dark, vivacious look, a black bowler hat worn at an angle, half a face split by a smile formed by lips which had just finished speaking, a foot thrust forward to take a step and fixed forever in that position. A peculiarity of that district are the cabs, without coachmen, driving along, unattended. It is not as if there were no cabbies, but mingling with the crowd and busy with 1,000 affairs of their own, they do not bother about their carriages. In that area of sham and empty gestures, no one pays much attention to the precise purpose of a cab ride, and the passengers entrust themselves to these erratic conveyances with the thoughtlessness which characterizes everything there. From time to time, one can see them at dangerous corners, leaning far out from under the broken roof of a cab as, with the reins in their hands, they perform with some difficulty the tricky manoeuvre of overtaking. There are also trams there. In them, the ambition of the city councillors has achieved its greatest triumph. The appearance of these trams, though, is pitiful, for they are made of papier-mâché, with warped sides dented from the misuse of many years. They often have no fronts so that in passing one can see the passengers sitting stiffly and behaving with great decorum. These trams are pushed by the town porters, the strangest thing of all, however, the railway station in the Street of Crocodiles. Occasionally, at different times of day, towards the end of the week, one can see groups of people waiting at a crossroad for a train. One is never sure whether the train will come at all or where it will stop if it does. It often happens, therefore, that people wait in two different places, unable to agree where the stop is. They wait for a long time, standing in a black, silent bunch alongside the barely visible lines of the track, their faces in profile, a row of pale cut-out paper figures, fixed in an expression of anxious peering. At last the train suddenly appears. One can see it coming from the expected side street, low, like a snake, a miniature train with a squat, puffing locomotive. It enters the black corridor, and the street darkens from the coal dust, scattered by the line of carriages. The heavy breathing of the engine and the wave of a strange, sad seriousness, the suppressed hurry and excitement transform the street for a moment into the hall of a railway station in the quickly falling winter dusk. A black market in railway tickets and bribery in general are the special plagues of our city. At the last moment, when the train is already in the station, negotiations are conducted in nervous haste with corrupt railway officials. Before these are completed, the train starts, followed slowly by a crowd of disappointed passengers who accompany it a long way along the line before finally dispersing. The street, reduced for a moment to form an improvised station filled with gloom and the breath of distant travel, widens out again, becomes lighter, and again allows the carefree crowds of chattering passers-by to stroll past the shop windows, those dirty grey squares filled with shoddy goods, tall wax dummies and barbers' dolls. Showily dressed in long lace-trimmed gowns, prostitutes have begun to circulate. They might even be the wives of hairdressers or restaurant band leaders. They advance with a brisk, rapacious step, each with some small flaw in her evil, corrupted face. Their eyes have a black, crooked squint, or they have hair lips, or the tips of their noses are missing. The inhabitants of the city are quite proud of the odour of corruption emanating from the Street of Crocodiles. There is no need for us to go short of anything, they say proudly to themselves. We even have truly metropolitan vices. They maintain that every woman in that district is a tart. In fact, it is enough to stare at any of them, and at once you meet an insistent, clinging look which freezes you with the certainty of fulfillment. Even the schoolgirls wear their hair ribbons in a characteristic way and walk on their slim legs with a peculiar step, an impure expression in their eyes that foreshadows their future corruption. And yet, are we to betray the last secret of that district, the carefully concealed secret of the Street of Crocodiles? Several times during our account, we've given warning signals. We've intimated, delicately, our reservations. An attentive listener will therefore not be unprepared for what's to follow. We spoke of the imitative, illusory character of that area, but these words have too precise and define a meaning to describe its half-baked and undecided reality. Our language has no definitions which would weigh, so to speak, the grade of reality or define its suppleness. Let us say it bluntly. The misfortune of that area is that nothing ever succeeds there. Nothing can ever reach a definite conclusion. Gestures hang in the air, movements are prematurely exhausted and cannot overcome a certain point of inertia. We've already noticed the great bravura and prodigality in intentions, projects, and anticipations, which are one of the characteristics of the area. It is, in fact, no more than a fermentation of desires, prematurely aroused and therefore impotent, and empty. It is an atmosphere of excessive facility. Every whim flies high, a passing excitement swells into an empty parasitic growth, a light grey vegetation of fluffy weeds, of colourless poppies sprouts forth, made from a weightless fabric of nightmares and hashish. Over the whole area there floats a lazy, licentious smell of sin, and the houses, the shops, the people seem sometimes no more than a shiver on its feverish body, the goose flesh of its febrile dreams. Nowhere as much as there do we feel threatened by possibilities, shaken by the nearness of fulfillment, pale and faint with the delightful rigidity of realization. And that is as far as it goes. Having exceeded a certain point of tension, the tide stops and begins to ebb. The atmosphere becomes unclear and troubled. Possibilities fade and decline into a void. The crazy grey poppies of excitement scatter into ashes. We shall always regret that, at a given moment, we have left the slightly dubious tailor's shop. We shall never be able to find it again. We shall wander from shop sign to shop sign and make 1,000 mistakes. We shall enter scores of shops, see many which are familiar. We shall wander along shelves upon shelves of books, look through magazines and prints, confer intimately at length with young women of imperfect beauty with an excessive pigmentation who yet would not be able to understand our requirements. We shall get involved in misunderstandings until all our fever and excitement have spent themselves in unnecessary effort, in futile pursuit. Our hopes were a fallacy. The suspicious appearance of the premises and of the staff were a sham. The clothes were real clothes, and the salesman had no ulterior motives. The women of the street of Crocodiles are depraved to only a modest extent, stifled by thick layers of moral prejudice and ordinary banality. In that city of cheap human material, no instincts can flourish, no dark and unusual passions can be aroused. The street of Crocodiles was a concession to our city, to modernity and metropolitan corruption. Obviously, we were unable to afford anything better than a paper imitation, a montage of illustrations cut out from last year's mouldering newspapers.